Hey everyone, welcome to the Module 3.1 PowerPoint. Although there is two PowerPoints up on Sakai for this module, we're only going to go over this one. The second one is titled Tissue Slides, and it simply covers, a breakdown of what we'll go over in the lab section. So you'll just see some microscopy of what's going on there. Here are your learning outcomes as always, and these are directly correlated to the study guide questions that you'll get for the Unit 1 exam. All right, so let's jump into it. Tissues are essentially groups of cells working together, and histology is the studies of those tissues. There's essentially four different types of tissues. You start with epithelial tissues, which generally cover the exposed surfaces, line passageway, things like that. Connective tissues, which will fill internal spaces and provide structural support. Muscle tissue, which will contract to provide active movements. And then nervous tissue, which serve to conduct electrical impulses. All of these tissue types have embryonic origins. There are three origins of all of these tissues. You have the endoderm, which generally gives rise to the functional linings of your digestive and respiratory tracts. You have the mesoderm, which gives rise to the components of the skeletal and muscular system. And the ectoderm, which gives rise to the epidermis of the skin. If you take a look at the prefixes, which you see here, endo meaning inside, so generally it's going to get correlate to the things that are on the inside. The mesoderm, or the middle, things that are going to serve as the middle components, or in this case, if you think of it in the terms of endoderm being your inside organs and things like that, the bone and skeletal system, muscular system, that's on the outside of that. And then the ectoderm, or ecto meaning outside or extra, giving rise to the epidermis of the skin. If you think the outside, skin is obviously on the outside. Your epithelial tissues, these include your epithelia and your glands. The epithelia, the major function is to provide physical protection. So they're going to protect against the exposed and internal surfaces from abrasion, dehydration, and deconstruction by chemical and biological agents. They also have to control permeability. Basically, they serve as a barrier for substances that enter and leave the body, and they have to cross the skin to get into your body. A lot of skin or a lot of epithelia are relatively impermeable, whereas others are permeable to compounds such as large proteins and things like that. There's a reason for that. So you don't want your skin being able to let anything through. Otherwise, anything we come in contact with, anything we touch is going to cross directly over into your body. They also help to provide sensation, and we'll talk about that more when we get to the integument system. But they can detect changes in the environment and convey information such as changes to the nervous system. That can show you a connection if you go back to the ectoderm, which gives rise to the skin and the components of the nervous system. This makes sense that this is able to transmit sensory information. They also help to produce secretions onto the body and are often scattered amongst other types of cells. So we already talked about some of the locations that you can find epithelia, such as coverings of the body surfaces, the skin, coverings in the body cavities. But you also have these specialized types of epithelia called glands. And these are essentially epithelial cells that have secretory functions. We have two types of glands that are found in the human body. You have endocrine glands, which secrete hormones into the interstitial fluid or the bloodstream. And these are ductless, meaning they do not contain ducts. And exocrine glands, which are essentially glands that secrete non-hormonal substances, think milk, wax, enzymes, oils, acids, that sort of thing, onto the external surfaces or internal passageways that connect to the exterior. Exocrine glands do have ducts. So that's one way that you can separate them. Essentially, it boils down to this. Endocrine glands secrete hormones directly into the bloodstream, and they don't secrete anything by ducts. Exocrine glands secrete everything else but those and do have ducts. There are three types of exocrine glands, and they secrete things in a different way. If you take a look at the picture over here to the right, it gives you kind of a visual breakdown of that happening. You have American glands, which are the most common type of exocrine gland, and these are basically enclosed in vesicles that'll move to the apical surface of the cell, or at least that top surface. And from there, the contents are released by exocytosis. You have the apical gland, which generally accumulate near the apical surface of the cell as well. A lot of these things will be released at that apical surface. And from there, its components will pinch off from the cell and then they're released. So it kind of cuts off the top portion of the cell and then releases. One thing to keep in mind is that both American and African glands continue to produce and secrete their contents with little damage caused to the cell, because if you look at the pictures over here to the right, most of the nucleus and the kind of central organelles that are important to maintaining homeostasis in the cell are undamaged. The Hollekin glands, however, involve the rupture and destruction of the entire gland cell. Basically, what happens is the entire apical surface of the cell breaks off and bursts open. So when that happens, you have heavy damage to the cell, and that cell essentially dies when it releases. All right, some of the characteristics of epithelial tissue. On either surface, they possess two structurally and functionally different things. You have the apical surface, which is the free edge and faces the exterior of the body. And you have the basal surface, which is usually attached with anchors to the adjacent tissue below. Most of the epithelia is supported by a basal lamina, or the basement membrane. And once we get into the integument, you'll be able to see a lot of this more clearly because it stains differently than the overlying epithelial. So you have a clear layer in there, or the lamina lucida, and then the dense layer, or the lamina densa. Again, we'll learn those 5 types once we get into the integument. The third characteristic is the cellularity, and they are extensively interconnected so that they create an effective barrier and work as if they were a single cell. If there were these large gaps in between them, then it would decrease that impermeability. So, speaking of in between these cells, you have several things that hold these together so that they can perform all vital functions. I would encourage you to know all 5 of these and be able to describe them. So you have occluding junctions that form a barrier that basically isolates the basolateral surface. You have adhesion belts, which essentially act together as a lock to form terminal webs of neighboring cells. 2 of the rather more important ones, the gap junctions and the desmosomes. Gap junctions prevent chemical communication that helps to coordinate activities with the adjacent cells. It pretty much acts as a messenger system in between these. You have desmosomes, which provide a firm attachment between the neighboring cells by connecting and interlocking cytoskeletons. A special type of desmosome called a hemidesmosome helps attach the cell to the basal surface of the basement membrane. I would encourage you to remember what the hemidesmosome is as well. And you have CAM, or cell adhesion molecules, which are essentially in the adhesion belt in the desmosomes and help to bind cells to the extracellular materials. Continuing with the characteristics of epithelial tissue, most epithelial is avascular, which means it lacks blood vessels, so all nutrients have to diffuse through the tissues, which means that you're usually going to find epithelial tissue to be not as thick as the underlying tissue. They are highly innervated, meaning that they are supplied with many nerve endings. This helps to relate that sensory information that we spoke on earlier. They also regenerate rapidly. Think about that in the sense that it would behoove your body to be able to replenish the skin quickly. This is just a breakdown on how to name all of these things, and we'll go through these. And again, we won't spend too much time on this because you'll be able to see this if you go through the tissue slides, which I encourage you to do, because on the lab practical and a little bit on the exam, you'll have to identify some of these tissues and then describe some of the shapes, the functions, and things like that. So it will help you to know the name so that you're able to identify these. So just going through these roughly, some of the types of simple epithelial, simple meaning single layer. So you have simple squamous epithelium, which is essentially a single layer of flat cells. All right. Because they're a simple layer, you're going to find these simple squamous epithelium and surfaces where things have to diffuse very, very quickly. So you're going to find these in things like the alveoli of the lungs. You have simple cuboidal epithelium. There's that word simple again, simple meaning one layer. Cuboidal meaning the cells themselves are going to be cube-like, essentially as tall as they are wide. And again, that simple layer, you're going to find places where things have to diffuse quickly, such as the tubules of the kidneys and some portions of glands. Simple columnar epithelia, it's going to be a layer of tall cells with the nucleus towards the bottom. Some of these contain cilia and things like that. So if you see these little hairs at the top here, which just increase motility of things, if you look back to biology 101, if you can remember the function of the cilia, which is to aid in, as I said, motility and movement of things, you can see where you may find some of these columnar epithelia. So in things like the digestive tract or the respiratory tract, where particles and other things have to move through, these cilia help to facilitate that movement. All right, now we're getting into the stratified epithelium, which simply means layered. So if you have strata, it just means layered. Essentially perform the same functions here, other than there are a multitude of layers. So stratified squamous epithelium is going to be that thick layer of flattened cells. The difference here is that some of these are keratinized and some are not. So you can have stratified keratinized squamous epithelium and stratified non-keratinized epithelium. And that essentially means that whether or not these produce the protein keratin. You also have stratified cuboidal epithelium and stratified columnar epithelium. Both of these are very rare in the human body. A couple of these that are pretty weird. You have pseudostratified columnar epithelium and then transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelium can be a little weird because it's really only seen in the uterus, the bladder, the urethra, in places that have to expand and contract relatively quickly and actually physically change their shape. All right, and this is just a rehash of the glands we spoke about earlier. A picture of that was blown up just a little bit. All right, now we're getting into the connective tissue, and these are usually the most abundant tissues in the body, usually never exposed to the outside environment, or at least they should be, and if they are, you should probably go see your doctor. The functions of connective tissues, if you know what the word connective means, you can probably figure these out. They essentially establish a structural framework of the body. They transport fluids and dissolve materials, protect against delicate organs. They support, surround, and interconnect other types of tissues, and things like that. So some of the characteristics, they all originate from a type of tissue called the mesenchyme. And they also are very widely in their appearance, but functions basically share three types of components. They all have simple specialized cells, things like fibroblasts, which produce connective tissue proper, or chondrocytes, which produce cartilage. That prefix chondro means cartilage. Osteocytes, which produce bone. That prefix osteo means bone. You have hemocytoblasts, which help to produce blood. Hemo meaning blood. A lot of them contain extracellular protein fibers. And depending on the content and the concentration of these fibers in the tissue, it helps to determine which type of tissue you have. So you have elastic fibers, which, as you can imagine, are very stretchy. They help things to stretch and move and twist and then able to return to their original shape. You have collagen fibers, which are usually thick, straight, and wavy, often form bundles, and they're very strong and help to resist stretching. So the direct opposite of those elastic fibers. And then you have reticular fibers, which are strong branching networks or scaffolding. If you think of scaffolding on the side of a building, it's there to be strong and provide support. And then they also have something called ground substance, and it's essentially a material that fills the space in between the cells. All right, getting into some of the connective tissue that we find. So some of the loose connective tissue is your areolar tissue, and that's the most common form of your connective tissue. And it's generally the packaging material in the body. Think packing peanuts when you think about this. Also sometimes called the superficial fascia that you'll find on the outside of things. You have adipose tissue, which is one of the most recognizable forms when you're looking at some of this microscopy. And adipocytes and adipose tissue are simply what we consider to be fat tissue. They appear different as you look over here to the side. because the contents of the cell are pushed out to the sides because of this large droplet of lipid in the middle here. So this empty space, or it looks like empty space, is just a large lipid droplet, and then your important cell organelles are all pushed to this outside layer. You have reticular tissue, which is found near the liver, the kidneys, the spleen, things like that, where it has to form a tough, flexible network to help support these things. Things where you can't have bone because that's too rigid, but you have this reticular tissue that helps to anchor and support. You also have dense connective tissue. So you have dense regular connective tissue, which helps to make up tendons and ligaments. Dense irregular connective tissue, which helps to form another strong layer. And then you have elastic tissue, which is going to be made up a lot of those elastic fibers, things that have to be able to stretch and compact back to where they originally were, or to provide support, things that have to compress and then come back. Cartilage. You have three different types of cartilage that we're going to talk about here. You have the hyaline cartilage, which is found connecting some of the ribs to the sternum. A lot of the cartilage in your body is going to be found on the ends of bones and things like that to provide sort of a cushion in between those. Also, hyaline cartilage is going to provide some support on the end of those bones, as well as reduce some of that friction in addition to absorbing some of that compressional force. You have elastic cartilage, which is found in things like the ear and the epiglottis being the little flap that separates the entryway into your lungs and your digestive tract. You have the fibrous cartilage, which is going to be near your intervertebral disc. So these are the things that are going to help, again, absorb some of that shock from the compression of bones. Your osseous tissue, or your bone, which is just a solid form of crystalline tissue that contains what we talked about earlier as osteocytes. Okay. Atypical long bone is hollow and contains two different types of bones. You have the compact bone and the spongy bone, and it contains a lot of different other things that we're not really going to focus on here. I just want you to be aware of it, but we'll cover this more when we get into the bones unit. You also have fluid connective tissue, which is blood, which is one of the other very recognizable types in addition to adipose tissue. And you can see it here. This is blood tissue. And you have one that we're not going to talk about necessarily here. You'll talk about more in 169, but lymph flows within the lymphatic system. Three different types of muscle tissue that we're going to talk about. Muscle tissue contracts with stimuli to cause movement, and they are highly vascularized. A lot of muscle tissue contain a lot of mitochondria, and that's because in order to do these high-level contractions, they require a lot of energy. So the three types we're going to talk about are skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. One thing you should notice about the skeletal, cardiac, and smooth is that skeletal is the only class that's considered voluntary, meaning that it requires extra neuronal stimulation in order to move, meaning that you have conscious control over your skeletal muscles, which is important. If you need to think about moving your arm, you want to be able to do so. And also your cardiac and smooth muscle is involuntary. You have some smooth muscle that is, in addition to involuntary, has a little bit of a voluntary component, but we can talk about that more later. Essentially, you want those two things to be involuntary. One, you don't want to think about having to make your heart beat, or two, you don't want to think about having to make your lungs breathe for you, or have your diaphragm contract, for example. The last tissue type we'll talk about are the nervous tissue, which essentially serve to transmit electrical signals throughout the body. These are some of the largest tissue cells. That's the end of the presentation here. Again, for a little bit more information, I would encourage you to go take a look at the second PowerPoint that's on here, and take a look at those tissue examples, because that's some information that comes from your lab manual.